Harlan Vetch grabbed his own daughter by the wrist and dragged her across the saloon floor like she was a sack of feed corn he was tired of carrying. "She's deaf," he hollered to the room, loud enough to rattle the bottles behind the bar. "Can't hear a damn thing. But she's strong, she works hard, and I'll give her to whoever clears what I owe. Take her, somebody, take her off my hands." The men in that saloon laughed. Some leaned forward with interest in their eyes that had nothing to do with work ethic. And Maren Vetch stood in the middle of it all, shoulders pulled in, eyes fixed on the floorboards, pretending she couldn't hear every filthy word. If you were standing in her boots that night, sold by your own blood, surrounded by strangers, with nowhere to run and nobody coming, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if they stay with you after the screen goes dark, please take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. Every week we bring you stories of people who were pushed to the edge and found something in themselves they didn't know was there. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Black Hollow, because what happened next in that saloon changed everything. The winter of 1887 came early to the Black Hollow territory, and it came mean. Snow had been falling since the last week of October, packing itself into the mountain passes and sealing off the high country like nature itself had decided nobody deserved to move freely anymore. Down in the valley, Black Hollow was the kind of settlement that existed, because gold had been rumored nearby, and men had followed the rumor before checking whether it was true. By the time most of them figured out there wasn't enough color in these hills to make a respectable man wealthy, they'd already spent their savings getting there. So they stayed. Not because Black Hollow was good to them, but because leaving required admitting defeat, and the kind of men who ended up in places like Black Hollow were not men who admitted things easily. The Rusty Nail Saloon sat at the dead center of town, which in Black Hollow meant it sat between a collapsed assay office and a general store that was perpetually out of whatever you needed most. On most evenings, the saloon was warm enough, loud enough, and dark enough that a man could forget for a few hours what his life had turned into. The stove in the corner worked hard. The whiskey was bad but consistent. And the men who crowded inside every night after dark had long since stopped expecting anything from the world to surprise them. That was the evening Harlan Vetch walked in and surprised them all. He came through the door with the wind, stumbling slightly on the threshold, the way a man stumbles when he's had 4 drinks but is pretending he's only had 1. Harlan was somewhere past 50, though hard living had put years on him that the calendar hadn't. His beard was the kind of beard that happened to a man rather than being grown on purpose. His coat had a tear along one shoulder that had never been mended. He had the look of someone who had once believed he deserved better than what he got, and had spent every year since making sure everyone around him suffered for that disappointment. Behind him, holding the door open against the wind a half-second longer than necessary, because she was still deciding whether it was smarter to stay outside in the cold, came Maren. She was 23 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes, though her mother had been dead long enough that Maren could only guess at the resemblance from a small tin photograph she kept hidden in the lining of her boot. She was thin in the way that comes from years of not eating quite enough rather than from any natural inclination. Her coat was clean, which said something about her, because everything else in her life had been dirty for a long time. She kept her eyes down. She had learned early that eyes up meant your father noticed you noticing things, and when Harlan noticed you noticing things, he found reasons to be angry about it. She stepped inside. The saloon smelled like wood smoke and wet wool and something fermented she couldn't quite name. She stood 2 steps inside the door and let Harlan move ahead of her, which was always the safest arrangement. Let him be the first thing anyone looked at. Let him take up whatever space he needed. She was good at disappearing into the background when Harlan needed to be the center of something. He pushed his way to the bar and ordered whiskey he almost certainly couldn't pay for, and then he turned around and looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he's trying to decide how much it's worth. Maren kept her eyes on the floor. She'd been doing that her whole life. Not because she was timid, though people always read it that way. She looked at floors because floors didn't look back, and floors didn't have opinions, and floors were honest in a way that faces never were. A floor was just a floor. It wasn't deciding what to do with you. Harlan drank his first whiskey fast and ordered a second, and while he was doing that, a man named Briggs Coyle moved away from the card table and walked toward the bar. Briggs was big in the architectural sense, wide through the shoulders, thick through the neck, with hands that looked like they'd been designed for an entirely different species and then attached to a human frame as an afterthought. He'd come to Black Hollow 3 years ago with enough money to buy his way into other men's goodwill, and he'd spent that goodwill badly. Most men in the saloon avoided looking directly at Briggs the way you avoid looking directly at something dangerous, not out of respect, but out of the animal understanding that attention sometimes makes things worse. Briggs looked at Maren, not quickly, the way a man glances at something he notices and then politely ignores. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already decided he wants and is just working out the logistics of acquiring. Maren felt the look. She always felt looks like that. She kept her eyes on the floor. Harlan had his second drink in his hand now, and something had shifted in his posture. He'd spotted Briggs looking at Maren, and there was a calculation happening behind his eyes that Maren recognized and had learned to dread. Harlan got a particular expression when he was turning a problem into what he believed was an opportunity. His face went a little loose, a little calculating, a little like a man who has just remembered he's holding something someone else wants. "That's my daughter," Harlan announced to the room. He said it loud, the way a man announces the opening bid at an auction. Several conversations quieted. A few men turned. "Maren," Harlan called, and when she looked up carefully, minimally, just enough to acknowledge without provoking, he waved her toward him like she was a dog he was signaling. She crossed the room, because not crossing the room would be worse. She stopped beside him at the bar and looked at the brass rail along its edge and waited. "She's deaf," Harlan said to the room as much as to any one person. "Deaf as a post since she was small. Can't hear you, can't understand you, can't talk back to you." He laughed at his own joke, and a few men gave polite sounds that weren't quite laughter. "Doesn't mean she's useless. She works harder than most men I know. Cooks, cleans, can skin a rabbit in under 4 minutes. I timed her once." He paused for effect. "I'm in a bit of a financial difficulty at the moment, and I'm looking for someone who'd be willing to help me out in exchange for, well, for Maren here." The room got very quiet, not the quiet of disapproval. The quiet of men who are listening carefully to the terms of something. Maren did not move. She had heard every word. She heard everything, had heard everything for as long as she could remember. The deafness was a performance she had started at age 9, after she discovered that her father tormented things that reacted and grew bored with things that didn't. If she flinched when he threw something, he threw more things. If she didn't flinch, he eventually wandered off, looking for something that would flinch. The deafness had started as a survival tactic and had become so practiced that most days she forgot it wasn't real. She was good at it the way a person gets good at anything they do for 14 years without stopping. She stood at the bar in the Rusty Nail Saloon while her father offered her to a room full of strangers, and she stared at the brass rail, and she did not react. Inside, she was calculating. She was always calculating. The exits were the front door she'd come in through, the back door behind the bar, which was probably bolted, and the 2 windows on the south wall, which were not large, but which a person could get through if they were motivated enough and thin enough. She was thin enough. The question was always whether there was anywhere worth going. Outside was the cold. Outside was the snow. Outside was 40 miles of mountain pass with nobody who knew her name on the other side of it. Briggs Coyle stepped forward. "How much?" he said. Harlan named a number. It wasn't a large number. It was, in fact, a humiliatingly small number the amount of money it cost to buy a meal and a room for 2 nights in the better hotels back east. The amount a family with modest savings might spend on a kitchen chair. Maren's jaw tightened. She controlled it immediately. Barely perceptible, a flicker of something that passed across her face and was gone before anyone could read it. Almost anyone. There was a man in the corner of the saloon who had been so still for so long that most of the room had forgotten he was there. He sat with his back against the wall and a cup of something that wasn't whiskey in front of him. And he'd been watching the room the way a person watches a room when they've spent enough time in wild places that other human beings have become just another kind of animal to observe and assess. His name was Silas Rourke. He came down from the high country twice a year, once in late spring and once in early winter to trade furs and buy supplies and have a handful of conversations with other members of the human race before he went back up to the mountain and didn't talk to anyone for 6 months. He was not a large man, exactly, but he was built in a way that suggested all his mass was being used efficiently. He had the kind of quiet that belonged to people who'd been alone long enough that they stopped performing for the room. He was watching Maren, not the way Briggs Coyle was watching Maren. He was watching the way she stood. He was watching her hands. He was watching the almost invisible tension in her neck when Briggs said the word "how much," and then he was watching the way that tension disappeared again, so fast that if you hadn't been looking for it, specifically, you'd have been certain you imagined it. Silas picked up his cup and set it down again without drinking from it. Briggs was moving toward Maren now, the way large men move when they've decided they're going to get something not fast, but with a kind of settled certainty, like physics was already arranged in their favor. "Let me have a look at her," Briggs said. Harlan waved his hand magnanimously, like a merchant gesturing at his finest display. Briggs stopped in front of Maren. He was close enough that she could smell the tobacco and the sour mash on him. He reached out and took her chin in one of those oversized hands and tilted her face up. And she let him. She let him because lunging away would have confirmed she could hear and understand what was happening. And the deafness was the only card she had left to play. If she lost the deafness, she lost the blankness. And the blankness was the only thing standing between her and the full weight of what was happening in this room. So she let Briggs Coyle tilt her face up like he was examining livestock, and she looked through him the way you look through a window at weather you've already decided you can't do anything about. Briggs smiled, not a kind smile, the smile of a man confirming a calculation. "She'll do," he said, and that was when the chair scraped back from the corner table and Silas Rourke stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make any dramatic movement. He just stood up, reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and produced a leather pouch that he set on the table with a sound that cut through the saloon noise the way a clean axe stroke cuts through green wood. "What's the debt?" Silas said. Harlan blinked. Briggs turned slowly with the unhurried movement of a man who isn't used to being interrupted. "I'm buying the debt," Silas said. He didn't say it like a challenge. He said it like a man stating a fact he already knows is true. "All of it, whatever he owes you, whoever he owes it to. Name the full amount." The saloon had gone entirely silent now. Real silence, the kind that happens when a room of people collectively understands that something is being decided, and they're not sure yet what it is. Harlan's eyes moved between Briggs and Silas with the rapid calculation of a man trying to figure out which direction trouble was most likely to come from. Briggs's jaw had set. "I was here," Silas said. He didn't argue the point. What's the debt? He was still looking at Harlan when he said it, not Briggs, which was either a deliberate provocation or a deliberate dismissal. Briggs was the kind of man who found both things equally intolerable. Harlan named the number. His voice had shifted. He'd heard something in Silas's tone that made him want to get the transaction done quickly and cleanly before it became something else. Silas opened the leather pouch. He counted out coin and placed it on the table in stacks, methodical and unhurried, and then he looked at Harlan and waited. Harlan picked up the money. His hands were not entirely steady. She's yours, Harlan said. He said it the way a man says something he's been waiting his whole life to say, all the ugliness that had built up for decades finally finding a clean exit. Maren stood in the center of the saloon and stared at the floor and did not react, and inside her chest something had happened that she couldn't name yet, some shift in the structure of things. The way ice shifts when the temperature changes, not breaking yet, but beginning to move. Silas crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from Maren, close enough for a conversation, but not so close that it was a claim. He didn't touch her. He didn't take her arm or her wrist or any other part of her. He simply stood in front of her, and he said quietly, in a voice designed to carry to her ears, but not much farther, "Come with me, or don't. But Briggs Coyle is going to take you if you stay." He turned and walked toward the door. Maren took 3 seconds. 3 full seconds where she stood perfectly still and ran the odds the way she'd been running the odds her whole life. A stranger in a mountain town who'd spent real money to get her away from Briggs. A man who hadn't touched her, hadn't looked at her the way Briggs had looked at her, hadn't spoken to her the way men in saloons spoke to things they'd just purchased. A man who had offered her a choice when the only other option was no choice at all. She followed him. The cold outside hit her face like a physical thing. The wind had picked up while they'd been inside, and the snow was falling in thick curtains now, cutting visibility down to perhaps 30 feet. Silas had a horse tied at the rail, a big gray mountain horse built for weather exactly like this, and he was untying it with the practiced movements of someone who did things like this in the dark, in the cold, without needing to think about them. He didn't look at her right away. He finished untying the horse, checked something in one of the saddlebags, and then he turned. "I've got a cabin up the north face," he said. "About 6 hours in this weather. You can ride and I'll walk, or I'll find you somewhere in town if you'd rather." He said it flatly, no suggestion in his voice that either answer was the wrong one. He was just presenting options with the same affect he'd probably used to discuss the weather. Maren looked at him. She was still playing deaf. She'd gone 23 years without breaking the act in public, and she wasn't going to start in front of a saloon in a blizzard. She shook her head once, slowly, and made a gesture that she'd developed over the years for situations like this, confused but willing. Silas watched her for a moment, and then he did something that stopped her cold. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't try to mime the words larger and more slowly, the way hearing people did when they forgot that deafness wasn't the same as stupidity. He just looked at her for one quiet moment, and then he turned to the horse and started adjusting the stirrup. He'd understood her gesture, or in this thought moved through her like cold water, he hadn't believed it. She climbed into the saddle. The horse shifted underneath her, and she gathered the reins without thinking, with the muscle memory of someone who'd been on horseback since she was small, and she felt Silas notice that too, the ease of it, the absence of hesitation, though he said nothing. He took the lead rope and started up the trail. Maren rode and watched his back and thought about exits and calculated odds, and tried to decide what the man in front of her wanted from her. Because, in her experience, everyone wanted something, and the only question was whether you found out before or after they took it. The snow fell. The mountain rose ahead of them. The lights of Black Hollow disappeared behind the storm. Whatever was coming, whatever waited at the end of this trail, Maren Vetch went toward it the same way she'd survived everything else in her life. With her eyes open and her mouth shut and every single sense she possessed working at full capacity. All of them, including the one nobody in Black Hollow knew she had. The trail up the north face had no name. Silas had never felt the need to give it one because the only person who used it was him, and he always knew where he was going. Maren did not know where she was going. She knew the direction up, always up. The horse's hooves breaking through the crust of snow, with a sound like something being torn, but direction and destination were different things, and she'd learned not to confuse them. Destination was something other people decided. Direction was just physics. She watched Silas's back. He walked with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned that unnecessary movement in the cold cost, something you couldn't always afford to spend. He didn't look back at her, not once in the first hour. She wasn't sure if that was because he trusted her not to bolt, or because he simply didn't care if she did, or because he was the kind of man who decided things and then stopped worrying about whether he'd decided right. She hadn't met many men like that. Most men, in her experience, needed constant confirmation that they were still in control of a situation. The ones who didn't need that confirmation were either very secure or very dangerous, and she hadn't yet worked out which kind Silas Rourke was. The wind came in sideways off the ridge above them, cutting through everything. The horse dropped its head and pushed forward without complaint, which told her something about both the animal and the man who owned it. Horses learned from the people who kept them. A horse that pushed through weather without flinching had been kept by someone who did the same thing. After an hour and a half, Silas stopped. He turned and looked at her for the first time since they'd left Black Hollow, and he said something. She watched his mouth. She was good at reading lips. She'd gotten good at it, the same way she'd gotten good at everything else that kept her alive, which was to say through relentless practice driven by the understanding that failure wasn't an option she could afford. He was asking if she was cold. She made the gesture that meant she was fine. He looked at her hands on the reins for a moment. She'd tucked her fingers inside her sleeves, which was not the gesture of someone who was fine, and they both knew it, though only one of them acknowledged knowing it. And then he turned back around and reached into the saddlebag and produced a pair of heavy wool gloves, which he held up toward her without comment. She hesitated. Taking the gloves meant owing something. In her experience, things given freely were the most expensive things of all, because the debt wasn't declared up front. Silas let his arm drop. He set the gloves on the saddle in front of her and turned back to the trail. He'd offered. He wasn't going to push. She could do what she wanted. Put the gloves on. Her fingers, which had gone from painful to numb in the way that numb felt almost like warmth if you didn't think about it too hard, started to come back to life inside the wool, and she hated how much of a relief that was. She didn't want to need things from this man. Needing things from people had historically been very costly. They pushed on. The cabin appeared out of the dark and the snow with the sudden quality of things that have been there all along and simply weren't visible until you were close enough. It was smaller than she'd imagined, which was itself information a man who lived alone built the amount of space he needed and no more. There was a covered porch with wood stacked along the wall in a pile that went almost to the eaves. The door was solid and fitted tightly in its frame. There were 2 small windows, both shuttered against the storm. A barn structure off to the left, connected to the cabin by a rope line, the kind of rope you strung between buildings in serious winter country so you could find your way from one to the other when the snow took your visibility down to nothing. Silas took the horse to the barn. Maren stood on the porch and waited, because going inside without being told seemed presumptuous, and presumptuous could be dangerous, and she had learned to be careful about doors she hadn't yet measured. He came back from the barn and found her still standing on the porch and said nothing about it. He opened the cabin door and went in and left it open behind him. She followed. The inside of the cabin was cold, but not as cold as outside, which was the best you could say about it. There was a stone fireplace against the far wall, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner that also served as the cooking surface, shelves along the east wall carrying a careful inventory of supplies, and a bed against the north wall that was piled with blankets in a way that suggested warmth was taken seriously here. The floor was packed dirt, covered in places with woven rugs that had seen better decades, but were still doing their job. Everything was where it belonged. Not neat in the performed way of people who wanted to make an impression, but ordered in the practical way of someone who needed to find things in the dark. Silas knelt in front of the fireplace and started building a fire. He worked without hurry, which was different. From working slowly, it was the pace of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had no need to rush it. Maren stood near the door and watched him, and kept the door cracked, which she knew was counterproductive in the cold, but which she couldn't fully make herself close. He glanced back at her once, looked at the cracked door. looked at her, turned back to the fire. "Leave it open if you need to," he said. Not to be kind, exactly. More like a man acknowledging a physical fact. The way you'd acknowledge it was snowing. She didn't close it for another 3 minutes. Then the cold became genuinely stupid and she closed it. The fire caught. The sound of it, the small initial crackle, and then the deeper, settling sound of wood deciding to burn, was the warmest sound she'd heard in longer than she could precisely remember. She moved toward it without fully deciding to, the body overriding the cautious mind, and she held her hands out toward the heat and felt something in her shoulders that had been clenched for hours finally loosen by one small degree. Silas stood. He went to the shelves and started assembling something for the stove. She watched him from the corner of her eye. Without looking directly, she'd developed that particular skill somewhere around age 11 and had been refining it ever since. He moved through the cabin like someone who'd made peace with the square footage available. He didn't bump into anything. He didn't reach for things uncertainly. He knew where every object was the way you know where furniture is in a room you've lived in for years. He put a pot on the stove. She smelled, eventually, the dense, plain smell of a basic soup dried beans and some kind of dried meat and something herby that she couldn't identify. Not fancy, functional. He set 2 bowls on the table. He looked at her across the room and tipped his head toward the table. She crossed and sat. He sat across from her. He poured soup into both bowls and set the pot back on the stove, and then he did something unexpected. He didn't eat right away. He sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that wasn't threatening, wasn't calculating, wasn't performing warmth it didn't feel. It was the expression of someone who had decided something and was about to say it. "I know you here," he said, 3 words after one more beat. 4 words that landed in the room like a stone, dropped in still water. Maren went completely still, every muscle in her body locked. She had been preparing for a lot of possible things from this man: demands, threats, the kind of negotiation that wasn't really a negotiation, but she had not been preparing for this. Nobody had said that to her since she was 9 years old. Nobody had looked at her steadily enough, and long enough and carefully enough to arrive at the truth that she had spent 14 years burying. She felt the urge to perform, to look confused, to tilt her head the way she'd practiced, to deploy one of the careful non-reactions she'd developed into such a precise science. She almost did it. Her body started to, and then something stopped it. Something in his expression. He wasn't saying it as a gotcha. He wasn't saying it the way Harlan would have said it with the heat of a man who'd discovered he'd been cheated and was already calculating punishment. He said it the way you state something that is simply true and has always been true, and that you don't hold against anyone. She stared at him. He picked up his spoon and started eating. "You don't have to pretend in here," he said, not looking at her now, giving her the privacy of his inattention. "I won't tell anyone." The soup was in front of her, and she was hungry. She'd been hungry for most of the ride, and was good at not noticing it, and she picked up the spoon and ate because eating was something she could do with her hands, while the rest of her tried to figure out what was happening. He didn't push it. He didn't say anything else on the subject that night. He ate his soup, and then he cleared the bowls and stoked the fire, and told her, speaking normally, not miming, not over-articulating, that the bed was hers. He'd sleep by the fire. He produced an extra blanket from a chest near the wall and dropped it near the hearth for himself. She stood by the bed for a while after he'd settled near the fire, watching him in the dim light, waiting for the thing she was, waiting for the thing that was always coming, that had always been coming her whole life, the cost of someone's apparent generosity. It didn't come. He went to sleep, or appeared to. His breathings slowed and steadied, and the fire popped and settled, and the wind outside found the gaps in the cabin walls and made itself known in small ways, and the whole night passed without incident. And Maren Vetch lay in someone else's bed with someone else's blankets pulled up to her chin and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a very long time. She was not afraid, or she was afraid, but it was a different flavor of fear than the one she was used to. The fear she was used to was the fear of a specific threat, a raised voice, a thrown object, a transaction being made in which she was the thing being exchanged. This was a different fear, the fear of something unfamiliar. The fear of not knowing the rules. She knew how to survive in a world where the rules were clear and consistently cruel. She did not yet know what to do in a world where someone gave you a bed and soup and then went to sleep by the fire without asking for anything. She was still working on that problem when, somewhere around 3 in the morning, she finally slept. She woke to the smell of coffee, which she hadn't expected, and for one disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the cabin came back to her, and the night came back to her, and Silas Rourke came back to her, standing at the wood stove with his back to her and his coat already on, clearly having been up for a while already. He heard her move, she could tell by the slight shift in his shoulders, but he didn't turn around. He gave her the minute or two it took to orient herself and sit up and push the blankets back, and then he poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table without ceremony. She sat at the table. She drank the coffee, was strong and bad and exactly right. He sat across from her again, and she expected him to revisit last night's declaration, the 4 words, the knowing, but instead he said, "I'm going to check the trap line. Be back by noon, most likely. There's food on the shelf." He stood and picked up his coat from where he'd hung it. "Don't go too far from the cabin. Weather's going to get worse before it gets better, and you don't know the terrain yet." He was almost at the door when she said it. "How did you know?" Her voice came out rougher than she expected. She hadn't really used it, directed at another person in years. Talked to herself sometimes. In the dark when Harlan was passed out, in the very lowest whisper, just to remember she still could. But actually speaking at someone, full volume, expecting to be heard, the voice wasn't sure about this. Silas stopped with his hand on the door latch. He turned back slowly. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it. She could see him doing it, which was different from the performance of thinking before giving an answer you'd already prepared. "Your hands," he said. "When Briggs grabbed your chin, your hands went flat against your thighs. Not clenched, not reaching, flat, like you were pressing something down." He paused. "I've seen that before. Animal caught in something. Knows if it struggles it makes it worse, so it goes very still and waits." He looked at her steadily. "That's not what a person who can't hear does. That's what a person who hears everything does." She looked at her hands. They were wrapped around the coffee cup. She didn't say anything, smart thing, Silas said. The pretending smart thing to do. He went out. The door closed. The cabin settled back into its particular quiet. Maren sat with the coffee going cold in her hands and felt something she didn't immediately recognize. Something that took a few minutes to identify. She felt like someone had looked at her and seen not what she was pretending to be, not what her father had told people she was, but what she actually was. And instead of using it, he'd called it smart. She sat with that for a while. It was an unusual thing to sit with. When Silas came back from the trapline at noon, she'd organized the shelves. Not because he'd asked her to, not as payment or to demonstrate usefulness, or because she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. She'd done it because the system wasn't as efficient as it could be, and reorganizing it had given her hands something to do while her brain worked through everything else. She'd moved the medical supplies to the most accessible shelf, rearranged the dry goods by how often they were likely to be needed, and found a crate of supplies behind the woodpile that had been pushed back far enough to be functionally forgotten. Silas came in, looked at the shelves, and said nothing about them for a full minute while he hung up his coat and poured himself water from the barrel. Then the bandaging cloth was at the bottom. Couldn't get to it fast once when I needed it. "I put it on the second shelf from the top," Maren said. "Left side, where your right hand goes first when you're reaching." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "Yeah," he said. "All right, that was how it started. Not with a declaration, not with an agreement, not with anything formal. With a reorganized shelf and a brief exchange about bandaging cloth. The negotiation of two careful people deciding whether the space between them was something that could be crossed. It took 2 weeks before the arrangement stopped feeling like a trap and started feeling like something else. Maren was suspicious of the something else, but she was honest enough with herself to notice the change. Silas did not behave the way men in her experience behaved. He didn't assign her tasks to demonstrate her usefulness. He didn't watch her in the way she was used to being watched. He went about his days with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything else, and she was simply in the space where he did those things. And if she helped with something, he acknowledged it plainly. And if she made a mistake, he said so without drama, and neither acknowledgement nor correction carried the weight of a transaction. It was the most disconcerting domestic arrangement she had ever been part of, which was admittedly not a large sample size, but she thought it would have been disconcerting even in different circumstances. On the morning of the third week, he came in from outside, carrying the rifle a Winchester that lived on a rack above the door, and he set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You'll need to know how to use it," he said. "I know how to use a rifle," she said. And then, because the truth was more complicated and he seemed like a man who could handle complexity, "I know how it works." "I've never fired one." "Different thing," he said. He picked it up again and held it out. "Come on." Outside, the cold had settled from the frantic blowing storm of recent weeks into something quieter and more serious, the deep, established cold of winter that had stopped announcing itself and simply was. The snow was crusted solid enough now to walk on without breaking through most of the time. Silas set up a target against a boulder, a piece of bark with a mark scratched on it, and stood behind her and to her right and talked her through the mechanics. He was a good teacher, not because he was patient in the soft way people called patience, but because he was precise. He said exactly what needed to be said and nothing extra. When she asked a question, he answered the question she'd actually asked rather than the question he assumed she meant. When she did something wrong, and she did several things wrong, beginning with her grip and continuing through her breathing and her trigger pull, he identified the specific problem and offered the specific correction without sighing or taking the rifle back or any of the other things men did when they were teaching someone something they didn't fully believe that person could learn. The first shot was bad. It went high and left and didn't come close to the mark. "Don't pull it," Silas said. "Press it, like you're pushing through something, not yanking it." The second shot was less bad, still off, but by a smaller margin. She could feel the difference in what her finger had done. The third shot hit the bark. Not the mark, but the bark. She lowered the rifle. She didn't smile, exactly, but something happened in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for, some satisfaction that was separate from pride. Because pride required an audience, and she wasn't performing this for anyone. Silas said again. They went back inside only when her hands had gotten cold enough that the clumsiness would have made further practice counterproductive. She sat near the fire and he made coffee, and neither of them spoke for a while. And the silence between them had changed from the cautious silence of two strangers being careful with each other to something more like the comfortable silence of people who don't need to fill all the available space. For a while, Maren said, "Why did you do it?" at the saloon. Silas was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Briggs Coyle's done that kind of thing before," he said finally. "In Calvert territory, 2 years back, bought a woman." Not it wasn't good, he stopped. She waited. "I had a sister," he said. And that was the entirety of what he said about it. And she understood that to mean the sentence contained everything and nothing else needed to be added. She looked at her coffee cup. "You don't have a sister anymore." No. They sat with that. It was a different kind of quiet again. The kind that held weight and still managed to be bearable. "I used to talk," Maren said eventually. She said it without deciding, too, the way things come out sometimes when the guard has been down long enough. "When I was small, I talked constantly. My mother said I narrated everything. What I was seeing, what I was thinking. Like if I stopped, the world would stop, too." She paused. After she was gone, I talked less, and after I figured out about the deafness, I stopped. How old were you? 9. Silas set down his cup. 9 years old, and you figured out that being silent was safer than being heard. It worked. Doesn't mean it should have been necessary, he said. Flat, not angry at her, just stating the wrongness of it the same way he'd state that it was cold outside or that wood burned. She felt something in her throat that she pressed down. She was good at pressing things down. She'd had 14 years of practice. I hum sometimes, she said. When I'm by myself, songs my mother knew. She wasn't sure why she was telling him this. I'd forgotten I did it until I caught myself doing it here. Silas looked at her across the table. I heard you, he said. Didn't say anything because it seemed like a private thing. She felt heat in her face that wasn't from the fire, and she turned slightly toward the window to deal with it privately. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most clarifying of her life, and those two things were not unrelated. Silas did not ease her into the mountain's demands. He couldn't afford to, and she didn't ask him to. The cold didn't ease. The work didn't ease. The trapline needed checking regardless of how her hands felt about it. Wood needed splitting whether her shoulders were ready or not. Silas showed her each thing once, maybe twice, and then expected her to do it. And when she struggled, he let her struggle unless the struggle was going to result in injury, in which case he stepped in without commentary and showed her the correction. She split wood badly for 4 days before her body figured out the relationship between the weight of the axe and the angle of the swing. She checked traps with clumsy hands and lost one catch completely because she fumbled the reset. She burned the first 3 things she tried to cook on the wood stove before she understood its particular temperament. None of these failures were comfortable. None of them were catastrophic. They were just the normal failures of a person learning things under conditions that didn't accommodate failure particularly well. What surprised her was that the failures didn't make her afraid. At home, Harlan's failure had been a physical event. It had consequences that landed on her body. Out here, failure was just information. Here's what went wrong. Here's the adjustment. Try again. The mountain didn't care about her enough to punish her for it. It just required the correct action or gave you the correct consequence, which was almost honest. She got better, not in a dramatic, sudden way. In the grinding, incremental way that things actually improve, where one day you notice you've been doing something correctly for a week without thinking about it, and the thing that had once required your full concentration has slid down into muscle memory where it belongs. She could load the Winchester now, in the dark. She'd tested it twice at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, sitting in the cabin with the fire burned down low, doing it by feel. She could reload it faster than she could count the seconds. She didn't tell Silas she'd done this. She just knew she could do it. She was at the woodpile one afternoon, the sky that particular white that meant serious weather coming, and she'd already started moving wood from the outdoor pile to the covered stack on the porch before Silas mentioned it, which he noticed, and she noticed him noticing when she heard something on the upper trail. Not Silas. The sound was wrong. Too many footfalls, too much noise, the careless crashing of something that didn't know these woods. She set the axe against the porch rail. She went inside. She took the Winchester from above the door. Silas came around the far corner of the cabin from the direction of the barn, and he saw her on the porch holding the rifle with the barrel pointed at the ground, and his eyebrows went up very slightly. Deer, he said, coming closer. 2 of them on the upper ridge this morning. They've been coming down for the lower brows. That's what you're hearing. She lowered the rifle. She felt briefly foolish, and then she stopped feeling foolish, because she'd heard something unfamiliar on the trail and responded to it correctly. The fact that it turned out to be deer rather than something else was circumstantial. The response had been right. Silas looked at the rifle in her hands. He looked at the position of her body, which was not the position of someone who'd picked up an unfamiliar object in a panic. It was the position of someone who'd picked up something they knew how to use. She was standing properly. Her grip was correct. The barrel was angled down and safe. He didn't say anything about it. He went inside to get his coat. But she thought she was fairly certain that the thing in his expression as he passed her was the same thing she'd felt when the third shot hit the bark. Some satisfaction that required no audience to be real. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing on that afternoon, with the white sky pressing down and the deer somewhere up on the ridge, was that the next test wasn't going to be deer on a trail. The next test was going to be blood and cold and the terrible arithmetic of a person alone with an emergency and no room at all for the luxury of not being ready. But she was almost ready. She had been becoming ready for weeks, a slow, accumulative way that readiness builds not as a plan, not as a decision, but as layers of competence deposited one on top of another, the way a winter laid down snow. Each layer pressing the ones beneath it into something solid and dense and load-bearing. The mountain had been waiting to find out what she was made of. It was patient that way. Mountains always were. They just kept being mountains until you either figured out how to live among them or you didn't, and the distinction was made plainly and without sentiment. Maren Vetch stood on the porch of a mountain cabin holding a rifle she knew how to use and watched the white sky and felt the particular cold of more snow coming, and inside her chest, in the place where the frightened girl from Black Hollow had once lived, something else was taking up the space. Something that hadn't been there before. Something that didn't have a name yet, but felt distantly and cautiously, like the early edge of a thing she might eventually be willing to call strength. The snow that had been threatening all afternoon finally committed itself around sundown, coming in heavy and sideways the way mountain snow did when it meant business. And Maren was inside feeding wood to the stove when she heard the sound she hadn't heard in weeks, hooves on the trail. One horse, moving fast, too fast for the conditions and the terrain, which meant either the rider didn't know the mountain or something was wrong enough that caution had become a luxury they couldn't afford. She had the Winchester off the rack before she consciously decided to reach for it. She stood to the side of the window, not in front of it, which Silas had mentioned once in passing as a habit worth having, and looked out through the gap at the edge of the shutter. The horse came through the tree line, and she recognized it immediately. The big gray. And Silas was on it, but the way he was on it was wrong. He was low, listing to the left, one hand on the reins and the other pressed against his right thigh. And even in the failing light and the snow she could see the dark stain spreading through the fabric of his trousers with the particular quality of something that wasn't stopping. She was outside before the horse reached the porch. She got to him as he was trying to dismount, and the dismount was going badly. His right leg wouldn't take weight, and he knew it, and was trying to compensate, which was making things worse. She got under his left arm without asking permission and took as much of his weight as she could, which was more than she would have thought possible 6 weeks ago, but was still not quite enough. They went down the last 2 feet together, not gracefully, both of them hitting the snow-crusted ground in a controlled fall that was about 60% controlled. "Inside," she said. The horse is fine." Inside, he didn't argue, which told her more than the blood did about how bad it was, because Silas Rourke did not stop arguing about things unless the argument required energy he didn't have. Getting him across the porch and through the door was a problem in moving weight that didn't want to be moved, and she solved it the way she'd been solving physical problems on this mountain for weeks imperfectly, with muscle and leverage and the refusal to stop until the problem was done. She got him to the bed and got him down onto it, and then she stepped back and looked at his leg and made herself look at it steadily and take in what she was seeing rather than reacting to it. The wound was on the outer right thigh, long and deep, and it was bleeding in the steady, serious way that meant something significant had been opened. Not arterial. If it had been arterial, he wouldn't have made it back up the mountain, but bad. Bad enough that the trousers were soaked through, and there was blood in his boot. "What was it?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Trap," he said. His voice was level but strained in the way that level voices got strained when being level was costing something. "Old one. Bear trap. Somebody said it wrong, left it wrong. I didn't see it, and he stopped. My fault. I was moving too fast. She was already at the shelves. The medical supplies were on the second shelf from the top, left side, where she'd put them 6 weeks ago. She pulled them down, bandaging cloth, a bottle of carbolic solution that was less than half full, needle and thread, the small jar of herbal preparation that Silas had shown her once and told her was good for infection, speaking about it with the matter-of-fact knowledge of a man who had treated his own wounds more than once. She set everything on the table and pulled the table next to the bed. She looked at his leg and then she looked at him. "I need to cut the trouser leg," she said. "There's a knife on my belt." She found it, unfolded it, cut the trouser fabric from the knee up. The wound was worse than it had looked through the blood-soaked cloth, which she had prepared herself for because things were generally worse when you looked at them directly. It was a gash about 4 inches long and deep enough in the middle that she could see the muscle, which was something she had never looked at before, and which she looked at now with the focused attention of someone who understood that being disturbed by it was a luxury she did not currently have. "Have you stitched anything before?" Silas said. "Not quite a question." "Fabric," she said, "seams, feed sacks, similar principle." "I know," she said. "Stop talking." He stopped talking. She cleaned the wound with the carbolic, which made Silas go very still in the particular way that a person goes still when something hurts badly enough that movement would make noise, and noise would cost dignity. She was as quick as she could be and as thorough as the wound required, and she didn't apologize for the pain, because apologizing would have been a waste of both their time. She pressed clean cloth against it, hard, until the bleeding slowed to something workable. And then she threaded the needle with hands that were shaking slightly, not from fear, she noted clinically, but from the sustained physical effort of getting him inside and the adrenaline that was still working its way through her system. And she told her hands to stop, and they didn't entirely, but they stopped enough. The first stitch was bad. She knew it was bad as she was making it, and she didn't stop. She pulled it through and tied it off and moved to the next, and the next one got better, and the one after that was better still. She worked her way down the wound with the concentration of someone diffusing something, blocking out the fire sound and the wind outside and the small sounds Silas made that he was trying not to make, keeping her focus on the specific square inch of tissue in front of her, and then the next, and then the next. When it was done, she sat back on the chair she'd pulled to the bedside and looked at what she'd stitched, and it was not a doctor's work. It was lumpy in places, and the spacing wasn't even. But it was closed. The wound was closed, and the bleeding had stopped, and the edges were together. "Done," she said. Silas was looking at the ceiling. He was pale in the firelight, the color gone from his face in the way it went when the body was redirecting everything to the center. He lowered his chin and looked at the stitched wound and looked at her. "How bad?" he said. "Not good. Better than it was." She uncapped the jar of herbal preparation. "This goes on now. I know what it is. I made it." "Then you know it needs to go on now." She applied it. He didn't complain about the stitching. He didn't offer critique. He lay back and let her work, and she understood that this was not easy for him, letting someone else manage a problem. Lying down while things happened to his body without his direction. And she understood it because she had spent her whole life having things happen to her body without her direction. And she knew that the voluntary version of it was still deeply uncomfortable. "You need to stay warm," she said when she'd finished. She added the spare blanket from the chest, "and you need water." "I'm going to get the horse." "Maren, the horse," she said, and went out. The horse was standing at the edge of the porch, exactly where Silas had left it, reins trailing, breath clouding in the cold. She took it to the barn and got it unsaddled and rubbed down and fed and settled. And she did all of it correctly, even though her hands were still unsteady, and the light in the barn was bad, and she was moving quickly because she didn't want to leave Silas in the cabin alone for long. The horse accepted her handling with the easy cooperation of an animal that was tired and cold and glad to be inside, and she latched the barn door and ran back through the snow to the cabin. He was where she'd left him. Good sign. His eyes were open and tracking her when she came in, which was another good sign. And she filed them both away and then cross-referenced them against the paleness of his face and the shallowness of his breathing, and the fact that he'd been in cold and shock for however long it had taken to ride back down the mountain. She put more wood on the fire. She boiled water and made him drink. He was resistant about the drinking in the way that people who were used to taking care of others were resistant about being taken care of. And she pushed through his resistance with the same flat persistence she'd applied to learning the trapline and the rifle and the wood stove. "You're going to drink all of this," she said, holding the cup. "I know how to manage. You know how to manage when you're on your feet. Right now you're on your back and I'm the one standing, so drink the water." He drank the water. The fever started toward midnight. She'd been expecting it and had positioned herself accordingly. She'd moved one of the chairs to the side of the bed and had the water ready, and a cloth for cooling and the herbal preparation within reach. When his temperature started climbing, she felt it before she saw it, the particular dry heat radiating from his skin that was different from the warmth of blankets and firelight. She put the damp cloth on his forehead and changed it when it warmed, and kept the fire built up and talked to him when he was coherent, and didn't try to engage him when he wasn't. He was only incoherent for about 2 hours, which she later thought was a testament to how fundamentally stubborn his constitution was. He talked during those 2 hours not to her, mostly, or not the her that was sitting next to him, but to people who weren't in the room. He mentioned a name once that she thought was his sister's. He argued with someone in a flat, certain voice about the set of a particular trap. He said something in what she thought might be a different language, only 3 or 4 words, low and private, not meant for anyone. She didn't remember, later, the exact moment the fever broke. She thought she might have been half asleep in the chair, because the awareness of it came to her gradually, the quality of his breathing changing, the rigidity going out of his body, his skin cooling from the dry, dangerous heat to something that was closer to normal. She came fully awake and pressed her hand to his forehead, and the fever had broken into sweat, and his color was coming back, and he was properly asleep, not the restless, burning semi-consciousness of the last several hours. She sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Outside, the storm was still talking to itself. The fire had burned low, and she built it back up, moving quietly, and then she sat in the chair and did nothing for a while. Just sat, just breathed. She was tired in a way that went past physical tired into something more fundamental, the tiredness of a person who has held something together through will alone and has only now been permitted to notice how much effort that required. She thought about Harlan. She didn't want to, but the mind went where it went in the small hours. She thought about the last time someone in her presence had been hurt and what she had done about it, which was nothing, which was the only option available to her then. A neighbor's boy had broken his arm in a fall one winter, and she'd stood at the edge of the yard while Harlan watched without moving, and she had done nothing, because doing something would have required an explanation for how the deaf girl knew what was happening, and the deaf girl could not know what was happening. She had done nothing. Tonight she had done everything available to her, and it had been enough. She sat with that. She didn't know exactly what to do with it, but she held it and looked at it and understood that it was significant. Silas woke up properly, fully, deliberately around an hour before dawn. She heard the change in his breathing and looked over and found him looking back at her, his eyes clear and focused, and obviously assessing her the same way she was assessing him. "Fever's gone," she said. "You've been out about 7 hours." He tested his leg by shifting it slightly, and his jaw tightened, but he didn't make a sound. "The stitching's going to hold?" "I think so. Don't test it." He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the chair she was sitting in, the chair that she had clearly been sitting in for a long time, positioned precisely where it needed to be positioned for someone monitoring a sick person through the night. "You stayed up," he said. "Yes. You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "Drink some water." He drank the water without arguing this time, which was how she knew he was still weaker than he was pretending. The argument was always the sign that he had energy to spend on something other than the essential. No argument meant the essential was taking everything. He healed slowly and badly the way people healed when they were too used to being self-sufficient to be good patients. By the third day, he was trying to get up, and she pushed him back down twice before settling on the approach of letting him get up and then making it clear through sheer logistical reality that she had already handled the things he was getting up to handle. He'd swing his legs over the edge of the bed with the intention of going to check something, and she'd tell him it was checked. He'd reach for his coat, and she'd tell him the wood was stacked. He was not, by nature, a man who accepted being managed, and she was not, by temperament, a woman who managed people, and the friction between those two truths was real and occasionally audible. The East trap needs to be reset, he said on the fourth day. He'd made it to the chair by the fire with her support, which he'd accepted with poor grace, and he was sitting up and looking more like himself, which she was glad of, and which she was also beginning to find exhausting. I reset it yesterday, she said. You reset the East trap. And the North, too. The South one had been tripped, looked like maybe a rabbit, nothing in it. I rebaited it. He was quiet for a moment. You went out to the trap line alone. You were asleep. The traps needed checking. The terrain up to the North traps. I know the terrain, she said. I've been out there with you 12 times. I wasn't confused. He looked at the fire for a while. She couldn't tell if he was annoyed or something else. With Silas, those two things sometimes occupied the same expression. You catch anything? He said finally. 2 rabbits and something that I think was a marten, but I wasn't certain enough to claim it confidently. I left it and reset. Where was it? Upper north, past the second pine stand? There's a drop in the ridge. The trap at the base of that drop. That's a marten trap, he said. You were right. It's where they run. She filed that away. She filed everything away.
It was a habit she'd developed in her years of performed
Deafness.
She'd had nothing to do while people thought she wasn't listening except pay extremely close attention, and she'd gotten very good at it.
And the skill had transferred cleanly to the mountain. He healed, slowly. The stitches held, which she was privately relieved about in a way she didn't fully examine. By the end of the second week, he could walk, with the assistance of a stick she'd trimmed and smoothed for the purpose, and by the third week, the stick was optional most of the time. He was not fully recovered. The leg was still stiff in the cold, and the deep tissue would be a long time knitting itself back into what it had been, and he was careful with it in the way he was careful about nothing else, which meant he understood its limits clearly and was respecting them rather than testing them, which was its own form of wisdom. During those weeks, the shape of the cabin changed. Not the physical shape, the walls and the furniture and the fire were exactly where they had always been. Space inside it rearranged itself around new facts. Maren went out when Silas could not. Maren came back and reported, and he told her what the report meant, and she added that to what she knew and the knowledge accumulated. She cooked consistently now, having made her peace with the wood stove and its particular temperament. She handled the rifle with a familiarity that was beginning to approach the casualness of genuine competence. She didn't think about the mechanics anymore the way she had in the beginning. Didn't have to consciously reconstruct the sequence of proper grip and stance and breath and pressure. It had moved down to the level where it lived without effort. One afternoon in the third week of Silas's recovery, she shot a rabbit at 40 yards with 1 round, and she didn't celebrate it or announce it. She just reset the rifle and picked up the rabbit and carried it back to the cabin, because that was the next step in the sequence, and the sequence had become natural enough that she moved through it without ceremony. Silas was on the porch when she came back, leaning on his stick, taking the air. He looked at the rabbit in her hand. 40 yards, she said, not because she was boasting, but because it was accurate information and he'd want it. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment. You're faster than I expected, he said. I had time to practice while you were on your back, she said, and went inside. She heard behind her something that was very nearly a laugh. The conversation she hadn't expected happened on a night 3 weeks into his recovery. When the storm had finally broken and the sky had gone clear, and the stars over the mountain were extravagant in the way that only happened when the cold was deep enough to scrub the air absolutely clean. Silas had made it outside to sit on the porch the first time he'd been outside at night since the injury, and she'd brought coffee and sat on the other end of the step, and they'd been quiet for a while in the way they were comfortable being quiet, which was a thing she still found remarkable about being in this place, this particular arrangement that quiet didn't mean danger. "I want to tell you something," Silas said. She waited. "When I went to the saloon that night, I didn't have a plan. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't thinking about. I just saw what was happening, and I couldn't leave it." He paused. "I've thought a lot about whether I made the right call. Bringing you up here, whether it put you in a different kind of situation that wasn't." "It wasn't the same," she said. "I know it wasn't. But you didn't know that. You didn't know who I was." "No," she said, "I didn't. That bothers me," he said. "That you had to trust something you had no basis for trusting." She thought about this. She looked at the stars and thought about the 3 seconds she'd stood in the saloon, deciding whether to follow him, and she tried to be honest about what those 3 seconds had actually contained. "I didn't trust you," she said. "I calculated that you were the better option." "That's different." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it better or worse? For you?" "Better," she said. "Trust is something you give. Calculation is something you do. I've always done better with things I can do than things I have to give." He turned his head and looked at her in the dark. She could feel the look without seeing it clearly. "That's very honest," he said. "You asked, I did." He looked back at the sky. And now, still calculation, she considered that. She owed him an honest answer, and she took the time to make it honest rather than quick. "Now it's both," she said. "The calculation still holds. But there's something else underneath it. Something I don't have a clean word for." He didn't push for the word. That was one of the things about Silas Rourke. He seemed to understand intrinsically that some things that didn't have names yet should be left unnamed until they were ready to be named. And pressing for the name early was how you got the wrong one. They sat under the stars and drank coffee that had gone most of the way to cold, and the mountain spread out below them in the darkness, enormous and indifferent and somehow not hostile. And Maren felt something that she was beginning to cautiously identify as the baseline of her own existence settling into something stable. Not happy exactly, because happy was a large claim, and she was a careful person with large claims. But settled, grounded in the specific and immediate reality of this porch and this cold and this coffee and this person next to her who had given her the most unusual gift she'd ever received, which was the space to become something she hadn't known she was capable of becoming. She did not know, sitting there under those particular stars, that the mountain was about to require one more thing from both of them. That the safety she'd been building carefully around herself for weeks was about to be tested in a way that no amount of preparation could make comfortable. That the thing she'd been running from since Black Hollow was not finished with her yet. She didn't know any of that. She knew the coffee was cold and the stars were extraordinary, and for the first time in her remembered adult life, she was sitting next to another person in the dark and not wondering what they wanted from her. That was enough. For tonight, that was more than enough. She had learned on this mountain that enough was a thing worth honoring. Because the people who couldn't let enough be enough were the people who ended up with nothing, always reaching past what they had towards something slightly better and slightly further. Until one day they reached too far, and the mountain informed them, plainly and without regret, that they'd used up all their chances. She was not going to use up all her chances. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and looked at the stars and let the night be exactly what it was. Cold and clear and temporary, and against all reasonable odds, hers. A week later, on a morning that started the same as every other morning, fire first, then coffee. Then the small ordered rituals that made a life out of a day. She was outside at the woodpile when she heard sounds that carried up the trail with the wrong quality. Not deer, not weather. Not any of the mountain's own sounds, which she'd catalogued by now with the systematic thoroughness she applied to everything that mattered. Voices male, two of them, coming up from the direction of Black Hollow. She had the axe in her hand. She set it down against the porch rail the way she'd set it down that afternoon when she'd thought she heard something on the upper trail. Her hand moved to the Winchester before the thought fully formed, the action preceding the decision, the body already understanding what the mind was still catching up to. She went to the door. "Silas," she said, her voice was even. She'd worked on that without meaning to, just by virtue of weeks of having to speak plainly in situations that required plain speaking. Someone's coming up the trail, two of them. She heard him move inside the particular rhythm of his movement, still accommodating the healing leg, still not quite the free gait she'd come to know in the weeks before the injury. She stepped back onto the porch and watched the tree line where the trail emerged from the upper pine stand, and she held the Winchester at her side with the barrel pointed down. And she waited with the patience of a woman who had spent 14 years learning that waiting was an active and purposeful state, not a passive one. The two figures came out of the trees, and the morning became something different than it had been. Harlan Vetch was in front, on a horse that looked like it had been ridden hard and unhappily. Beside him was Briggs Coyle, and the sight of Briggs after the weeks of absence hit her differently than she would have predicted, not the cold fear she'd expected, not the suppressed panic she'd felt in the saloon with his hand on her chin. What she felt was something harder and simpler than fear, something closer to the flat, clear-eyed attention she brought to a target at 40 yards. She stood on the porch of the cabin with the Winchester at her side and waited for them to come to her. Harlan spotted her first. She saw him recognize her, the slight reordering of his expression, the surprised recalculation, the thing underneath it that was not quite shame and not quite anger, but contained elements of both. He had not, apparently, expected her to be standing on a porch with a rifle. He had expected, she thought, to find a different situation. To find Silas in charge of everything and her somewhere in the background. The world was full of people who made incorrect assumptions. Behind her, she heard Silas come to the doorway. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the two men coming down the last 100 yards of trail, and she felt rather than saw or heard him stop in the doorway. And she heard the sound of his breath, and she heard it change slightly when he registered who was on the horses, and then she heard him be quiet, which was the sound of a man who understood that this moment was not his. Harlan pulled up his horse 30 feet from the porch. Briggs stopped beside him. They both looked at her, and then at Silas in the doorway, and then back at her, and she watched them do the arithmetic of the situation wounded man in the doorway, woman on the porch, rifle, and the particular way she was holding it, which was the way of someone who wasn't afraid of what she was holding. Harlan opened his mouth. Maren raised the Winchester. Not aimed. Not yet. Just raised, barrel tilted upward, the action itself speaking before any word was necessary. She watched both men's horses shift at the movement and watched both men's hands go carefully still. Maren, Harlan said. He said her name with the particular inflection of a man who was used to her name meaning something he owned, and hearing it in that inflection, after weeks of her name meaning something entirely different in this place, made something crystallize in her that had been building for a long time. She looked at her father across 30 feet of mountain morning, and for the first time in her life, she did not look away. Parp 4, Louis, vit du 6,000. 500 de lien kate lien mike vikak van chuk chum cochient, befahoy twite doutain mot cochient lien mike ki geplai. Moit van lien mike de van chuk, kom zoithiot like cochient ado van mui. Lien kate kak van kwa cochient mot kijk lien mike. Suzum cochient tip zua kak van, ji chi chude. Trang at kwang dot mot, kom suzum kijk do zom hok tiude fu, fong kak cochient mi hua ki zom van zao kam suk. Ke theo noi tu ba. Zdo kik ting kom Vietland man. Nunvit kom huan hao. Hui twai tu nien. Trangon ngu van chung sao zoi va kum thu AI dien hin. Viet nyu nya van chuen niep kom nyu AI ko gang ne sang. Kyoto kan ngui. Cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Louis trả lời trong một tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dẫn bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng, nếu đã đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dừng giữa câu, hãy biết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. 30 feet was not a large distance. She had shot rabbits at 40 yards and felt no particular pride about it anymore, because 40 yards had become routine. 30 feet was the distance between her and the two men who had, between them, shaped the worst years of her life, and at 30 feet, on a clear morning with no wind, with a rifle she knew the particular personality of the way you knew the personality of something you'd handled every day for weeks, she was not afraid. That was the thing she noticed first. She'd expected the fear. She'd been carrying a version of it since Black Hollow, a low-grade background hum of it, the anticipation of this exact moment arriving someday in some form. And now the moment was here, and the fear wasn't. What was there instead was something clearer and less complicated, a focused attention that had no room in it for anything that wasn't directly relevant to the next 60 seconds. Harlan was doing the thing he always did when a situation wasn't going the way he'd planned it. He was talking. Filling the space with words the way a man fills silence with noise when he doesn't know what else to do with it. Now, Maren, he said, his voice had the particular quality it got when he was performing reasonableness, which was a performance she had watched her whole life and could read like a page of large print. I don't know what he's told you, but the arrangement he made, that wasn't legal. Can't buy a person. I shouldn't have. I made a mistake that night. I'll own that. I'd had too much to drink and I wasn't thinking right, but that doesn't mean you belong up here with. I heard you, she said. He stopped. The two words landed in the space between them and rearranged everything. She watched his face go through 3 or 4 different expressions in quick succession: confusion, recalculation, the slow, terrible arrival of understanding. What did you... I heard you, she said again, that night. And every night before it, and every morning, every word you said when you thought I couldn't. She kept the Winchester steady. Her arms had stopped shaking somewhere in the middle of the second week of practice and hadn't started again since. The thing you said to Dunmore at the feed store when I was 11. What you told Parson Wells about why my mother left. The night you came home from Calvert and you sat at the kitchen table and you talked to yourself for an hour about everything you thought you deserved that you hadn't gotten. She paused. I heard all of it. Harlan's face had gone a color that wasn't quite white and wasn't quite gray. His horse shifted underneath him, and he steadied it with a hand that wasn't entirely steady itself. You were never deaf, he said. It came out barely above a sound. No, how long since I decided it was safer than the alternative? She watched him work out the math. She watched the years stack up behind his eyes as he counted backward, figuring out what that meant, what it meant that she had stood in front of him for all those years and heard every word and shown him nothing. She watched something move across his face that was complicated rage, trying to find purchase on something, but not finding it because there was nothing here to push against the way he was used to pushing. Briggs Coyle had been quiet through all of this in the way of a man who is waiting for the situation to clarify before he decides what his role in it is going to be. He was watching Maren with an expression that was harder to read than Harlan's Harlan she knew. Harlan she'd studied for years, but Briggs was a different construction. He was the kind of man who had never particularly needed to understand people because he'd always been large enough that understanding wasn't required. He operated on simpler principles. He wanted the thing. He was here to get the thing. The talking was Harlan's part of the arrangement. But Briggs had a shotgun across his saddle that she'd been tracking in her peripheral vision since they came out of the tree line, and his right hand was closer to it than it had been 30 seconds ago. The money Rourke paid, Harlan said. He was trying to regroup. She could see the effort of it. That was a transaction between men. It doesn't change what you are to me. I'm your father. You sold me for the price of a week's worth of whiskey, she said. To a man you knew was going to. She stopped. She didn't need to finish that sentence. Briggs knew what the end of it was, and Harlan knew what the end of it was, and she wasn't going to give either of them the satisfaction of making her say it out loud. You stood in a room full of people, and you offered me to whoever would take me, and the only person in that room who treated me like a human being was a stranger who owed me nothing. So whatever you think being my father means right now, I'd reconsider how much weight you're putting on it. Harlan's face changed again. The performance of reasonableness had cracked all the way through now, and what was underneath it was what had always been underneath it, the meanness that lived at his core, the part that couldn't tolerate being defied, that needed things below him to stay below him, because his own level was already so low that any elevation in the things beneath him felt like a direct attack. You come down off that porch, he said, and his voice had dropped into the register she knew, the one that lived below the performance, and once upon a time that register had made her go very still and very quiet. You come down off that porch right now, and we'll talk about this like... No, she said. The word came out simply, not hot, not angry, just flat and final the way a door closing is flat and final. One syllable that contained everything the last 2 months had taught her about who she was when nobody was deciding that for her. Harlan stared at her, and then he made the mistake of looking past her at Silas in the doorway and directing his next sentence at him instead of her. Rourke, he said, this is a family matter. You've had your use of her now. Maren raised the Winchester the rest of the way, not pointing at Harlan. Pointing at the space between them, the barrel elevated slightly, a clear statement of a thing that was about to become clearer. Don't talk to him, she said. Talk to me. Or don't talk at all. But you don't talk to him about me like I'm not standing here holding a rifle. Silas, behind her in the doorway, said nothing. She'd felt him there throughout a steady background presence that wasn't directing anything, wasn't pushing, wasn't the kind of support that was really just another form of control. Was simply there, the way the cabin wall was there, solid and not going anywhere. Harlan's eyes came back to her. She could see him recalculating again. He was not a man of great strategy, but he was a survivor, and survivors had instincts, and his instincts were telling him something about the woman on the porch that was different from anything they'd ever told him about his daughter before. She used the silence. Here's what I remember, she said. Her voice had leveled out into something almost conversational, which she knew was more unnerving than heat would have been. She'd learned that from Silas the power of plainness, the way a statement delivered without drama landed harder than one surrounded by noise. I remember the winter I was 12. The creek froze early, and we lost the East Field fence, and you spent 3 days sitting in the kitchen saying it was my mother's fault for dying and leaving you to handle it. I remember you telling Milt Crawford's wife that I was too simple to be educated, so there was no point sending me to the school. I remember every night you came home, smelling like the rusty nail, and I'd hear your boots on the step, and I would count the footsteps to figure out how drunk you were before you came through the door. And I'd have the kitchen already cleaned and the stove already built up, and I'd sit at the table looking at nothing, because the times you found me looking at nothing were statistically the safest. She said statistically without planning to. It was Silas's word, or the way Silas thought about things in patterns, in observations tracked over time. She had absorbed it without noticing, and now it came out naturally. I remember the night you told Briggs Coyle, she said, and watched Briggs's eyes sharpen slightly, that I was strong enough for heavy work and that I didn't complain because I couldn't hear well enough to have opinions. I remember him laughing at that. I remember thinking that you had just described what you thought was your daughter's greatest quality, and it was that she couldn't talk back to you. Harlan's jaw had set. He was past the pale and shaking phase and into something else now, something that in the old days would have preceded throwing something or breaking something or finding some way to make the world around him absorb the impact of his feelings. Get down off that porch, he said, final sounding. like a man who had decided this conversation was over and was announcing the fact. "I'm not coming down," she said. "You are going to turn those horses around and go back the way you came." "You don't tell me." "I just did." Briggs moved. It wasn't fast, exactly. It was the movement of a man who had been patient long enough that the patience had run out, a man who had made his decision and was now implementing it. His right hand dropped to the shotgun across his saddle. He lifted it, not all the way, not full aim, just the first part of the movement, the part that said, "We are done negotiating." Time did something strange. Not slow, exactly. The way people described crisis moments as slow, it wasn't slow. It was sharp. Everything went very precise and very specific. The distance to Briggs, the angle of the shotgun, the direction of the barrel, Silas's position in the doorway behind her and to her right. She moved the Winchester, not to Harlan, to Briggs. And she fired. The sound of it hammered off the cabin walls and the tree line and came back from the mountain and was enormous in the quiet morning air. The recoil hit her shoulder the way it always did, the familiar impact that she'd stopped bracing against because bracing against it made it worse, and she'd learned to accept it instead. Briggs came off the horse, not the way men fell in the stories she'd heard, the dramatic backward collapse of someone shot through center mass. He went sideways and down, the shotgun flying free, his left shoulder. She'd aimed for the shoulder. She'd thought shoulder. And she'd hit what she aimed at, taking the round in a way that spun him and dumped him off the right side of the horse and into the snow. The horse bolted. Harlan's horse shied, and Harlan grabbed for the reins and nearly lost his seat. And in the 3 or 4 seconds that took her, she had worked the lever, the familiar, smooth mechanical action that she could do without thinking, and had the next round chambered and the barrel moving back to Harlan. Briggs was making noise in the snow, not words, just noise. He was alive, and he was down, and his right arm was working, and his left wasn't, and the shotgun was 6 feet from him in the snow, and he was not reaching for it. Good. That was the calculation she'd made when she aimed for the shoulder rather than the center, leave him the capacity to be in pain, but not the capacity to act on anger. A man in pain who couldn't use his arm was not the same threat as the same man functional. She had made that calculation in the space of less than a second, and she did not find this remarkable until much later, when she had time to think about what it meant that she could think that way now. Harlan had gotten his horse under control. He was staring at Briggs in the snow, and then at Maren on the porch, and the color had finished draining from his face completely. She kept the barrel on him. "Your friend is alive," she said. "He's going to need someone to look at that shoulder. I'd start back down the mountain now if I were you. It's a long ride to anywhere a doctor lives." Harlan opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "Whatever you're about to say, don't." He closed his mouth. She watched him. She watched the thing moving behind his eyes, the familiar architecture of Harlan Vetch's inner world, which she had studied through 14 years of careful observation. He was not a complex man. He wanted what he wanted, and he resented what he couldn't have, and he'd spent his whole life making the people around him smaller, so that his own size, which was not impressive, felt more acceptable by comparison. She had been the most available person for that project for as long as she could remember. She watched him try to find something to say that would restore the balance he was used to, that would put her back in the position she'd occupied for 23 years, and she watched him fail to find it. And she watched him understand that he was failing. "I remember everything," she said. Not loud, not heated. Just true. Every word. For 14 years. I want you to know that, so that when you ride back down this mountain, you know exactly how much I know, and you think about that before you ever consider coming back up here." Harlan said, in a voice she barely recognized, smaller than his voice had ever been in her experience, "You're my daughter." "I know," she said. "I know exactly what I am and what I'm not. And right now what I'm not is afraid of you." She lowered the rifle slightly. Not down, just slightly, a controlled gesture rather than a surrender. "Take Briggs and go, Harlan. Don't come back." Briggs had gotten himself partially upright in the snow, cradling his left arm. He was white-faced and breathing hard through his nose. He looked at the distance between himself and the shotgun in the snow and made a calculation of his own, and whatever that calculation produced, it produced the conclusion that the shotgun was not worth the additional conversation it would open. He was smarter than she'd given him credit for, or the shoulder was making him smarter than he would otherwise have been. Pain had a way of clarifying things. Harlan climbed down from his horse slowly, with the deliberate movements of a man who was aware he was being watched and was trying not to make any sudden ones, and helped Briggs to his feet with the minimal efficiency of someone performing a necessary task rather than an act of care. He got Briggs's good arm over his shoulder, and they went to the horses, and getting Briggs into the saddle was difficult and ungraceful, and she stood on the porch and watched all of it without moving. Silas had come out of the doorway onto the porch. She could see him now at the edge of her peripheral vision standing without the walking stick, which meant he'd left it inside and was managing the leg on Will, which she would have something to say about later. He was watching Harlan and Briggs with an expression that was unreadable in the specific way. His expressions were sometimes unreadable, not blank, but internal, like the reading was happening on a frequency she didn't have full access to yet. Harlan got Briggs into the saddle. He took the reins of Briggs's horse in his left hand and stood for a moment at the head of his own horse and looked back at the porch. He looked at Silas first briefly, and whatever he found in Silas's expression didn't offer him anything. Then he looked at Maren. She didn't look away. She hadn't looked away from him once in this entire encounter, and she wasn't going to start now. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read everything that was in it: anger, certainly, and the specific humiliation of a man who has been defied publicly by someone he considered beneath defiance. But there was something else in it too, something she hadn't seen in her father's face before, and that took her a moment to identify. It looked distantly and uncomfortably, like recognition. Like a man seeing something for the first time that had been there all along. He turned away. He climbed onto his horse. He started back up the trail toward the tree line with Briggs's horse in tow, and he didn't look back. And she stood on the porch with the Winchester and watched him go until the trail curved, and the pine stands swallowed them both, and the sound of the hooves faded, and the mountain was quiet again. She stood there for another full minute after they were gone. The rifle was still in her hands. She was aware of Silas beside her and of the particular quality of the air after the sound of the shot had stopped reverberating, and of the sky, which was the same sky it had been an hour ago, still winter pale, still enormous, entirely indifferent to what had just happened on this porch. Her hands were not shaking. She checked them, still. She set the rifle against the cabin wall with the care she always used with it, barrel upward, away from anything that could snag the trigger, and she turned around and looked at Silas. He was standing without the stick, weight distributed the way it distributed when he was trying to minimize what the leg was doing, which meant it was doing something. "You left the stick inside," she said. "Yes. Go back inside and get it. Maren, the leg is not healed enough for you to be standing out here without it for extended periods. Go inside and get the stick." He looked at her. Something in his face that was complicated and entirely human. "I didn't know if you'd fire," he said. "I knew," she said. "I knew as soon as he reached for the shotgun, I wasn't going to let him point it at you." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You aimed for the shoulder." "Yes, that's a precise shot under pressure, yes." "I didn't teach you to aim for shoulders specifically." "No," she said. "I worked that out myself. If I killed him, we'd have more problems than we solved. If I left him functional, we'd have more problems." Shoulder was the answer. She paused. "Probably. I'm less certain about the reasoning the further I get from the moment." He looked at her for a long time, with an expression she was getting better at reading. It was the expression he had when he was updating something, when new information had arrived that required him to revise a calculation he'd already made. "Come inside," she said. "Your leg is not your friend right now." He went inside. She followed him. She put the Winchester back on its rack above the door with practiced ease and stood for a moment looking at it on the wall and thinking about Briggs in the snow and Harlan's face when she'd said, "I heard you and the 3 seconds in the saloon when." She'd decided to follow this man up a mountain in a blizzard. The chain of it, the way one choice connected to the next. She thought about the 9-year-old girl who had decided that silence was the only strategy available to her. And she thought about what that girl would have made of this morning. And she thought that the 9-year-old would have been astonished and possibly terrified and would not have believed it was possible. Which was not a criticism of the 9-year-old. The 9-year-old had done what she needed to do with what she had, and what she'd had wasn't much. She had more now. That was the plain fact of it. Silas had lowered himself into the chair by the fire and had the leg extended and was doing the thing he did when he was managing pain and didn't want to discuss it, which was looking at the fire with the specific focus of a man who was thinking very hard about a fire. She put coffee on the stove. She moved around the cabin doing the after-morning tasks the rifle needed cleaning. She'd do it after the coffee. The porch had blood on the snow that would need to be addressed before it froze into something permanent. The day's wood hadn't been brought in yet. All of it ordinary. All of it the ordinary maintenance of an ordinary mountain morning, layered on top of what had just happened. She brought Silas his coffee. She sat down. "He won't come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Silas said, "he won't." Because of the rifle, or because of the other thing? "Both," Silas said. "Mostly the other thing. The other thing." 14 years of hearing. Every word. The look on Harlan's face when he'd understood the scope of it. "I thought I'd feel different," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it. "I don't know." More finished. "Door closing. And it felt like a door closing," she said slowly. "Just not in the way I expected. Not like resolution. Like the actual sound of a door. Just a sound. And then it's quiet." She looked at her coffee. "I thought I'd feel more. Sometimes the things you wait the longest for are the quietest when they arrive," Silas said. He said it without decoration, the way he said most things. She looked at him across the fire. He looked back. "Your leg is worse than you're pretending," she said. "Yes, how much worse?" "It'll be fine by tomorrow." "That's not an answer to the question I asked." He almost smiled. "It hurts. It'll be fine by tomorrow," she let it go. She would check it herself later, and he knew she would. And they both understood that this was how things worked now in this cabin. He couldn't be entirely honest about his own physical condition without effort. And she would therefore verify it independently, and neither of them would make a larger issue of it than it was. Fire popped. Outside, the mountain morning continued doing what mountain mornings did. At some point later, she would go to the spot on the trail where Briggs had fallen, and she would look at what was there, and she would assess what needed to be done about it. There would be blood on the snow, and she would deal with it practically, because things that needed to be dealt with practically were better dealt with than avoided. But right now, she sat with her coffee and the fire and Silas, and the quiet that followed was the cleanest quiet she had ever been inside. Not the enforced quiet of a child who had learned that reacting was dangerous. Not the performed quiet of a woman pretending she couldn't hear. The quiet of a person who had said the things that needed to be said and done, the things that needed to be done, and was now simply in the aftermath of those things, which was its own kind of territory, and she was learning to inhabit it. She thought about Black Hollow, the saloon, the brass rail she'd stared at. The 3 seconds. She thought about the first shot high and left, going wide of the bark entirely, and the 5th shot that hit the mark, and the 40-yard rabbit, and Briggs going sideways off his horse. She thought about the girl who had talked constantly, narrating the world because she was afraid that if she stopped, the world would stop too. That girl had stopped talking for 14 years, and the world had continued without her narration, indifferent as mountains were indifferent, and it had taken a stranger and a blizzard and a long winter on a mountain to return her own voice to her. And the voice that had come back was different from the one that had gone away. Quieter in some ways, more certain in others, less interested in narrating and more interested in simply existing inside the thing that was happening, which was a shift she didn't have a complete language for yet, but felt true. She would work out the language later. She had time now. That was new, too, the sense of time as something she had, rather than something that was happening to her. Time to learn things, to become better at things, to fail at things and try again. Time to figure out what she wanted, which was a question she had never in her adult life had the safety to seriously ask. She looked at the cabin around her, the shelves she'd organized, the herbs drying near the window, the wood stove she'd made her peace with, the rack above the door where the Winchester lived. She looked at Silas in his chair by the fire, leg extended, looking back at her with the expression that had been updating and updating over weeks of new information, and was still, she thought, not finished updating. "Thank you," she said. He looked slightly surprised. Not a common expression on his face. For what specifically, he said, because he was a man who was careful about accepting things without knowing what he was accepting. "For the first morning," she said, the rifle on the table. Not she stopped, tried to find the precise thing. "Not for saving me, for deciding I could save myself, and then making space for that to happen." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire was doing what fires did in the middle of a long morning, settling into a steady burn, neither ambitious nor diminishing, just burning. "You would have gotten there without me," he said. "Would have taken longer, been harder, but you would have gotten there." "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to, and that's what I'm thanking you for." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, the mountain held its usual silence, which was not really silence. At all, it was full of wind and the sound of the trees moving, and somewhere up on the ridge, the particular sound she'd come to associate with the marten that ran the north trap line, which was exactly the sound she'd cataloged and filed 2 weeks ago when she'd found the trap at the base of the ridge drop. She would reset that trap this afternoon. The leg could wait until tonight. The wood needed to come in before the temperature dropped again. The morning was hers, and the afternoon was hers, and the quiet after Harlan's horses disappeared into the pines, what hers was too earned and specific, and belonging to no one who hadn't put in the work of it. She finished her coffee. She stood up. She had things to do. She did the things that needed doing. That was how the rest of that day went, one task pulling the next behind it, the way a sled pulled a load, each thing completed, making the next thing possible. She brought in the wood before the temperature dropped. She cleaned the Winchester with the particular care she'd developed for it, running the patch through the barrel and checking the mechanism with the focused attentions of someone who understood that a tool you depended on deserved the respect of proper maintenance. She went to the spot on the trail where Briggs had fallen, and she looked at what was there and dealt with it, snow covering what needed covering. The shotgun retrieved and brought inside, because a weapon left on a trail was an invitation to a different kind of problem. She did all of it without ceremony, without the feeling she'd half expected to feel, the lightness, the release, whatever dramatic internal shift she'd imagined would follow a morning like that one. What she felt instead was the same thing she'd been feeling for weeks on this mountain, which was the plain satisfaction of tasks done correctly, one after another, in the right order. Silas watched her from the porch when his leg permitted it. When it didn't, she could feel him watching from the window, which she pretended not to notice because he was already touchy enough about the leg without her adding commentary about his surveillance of her activities. That evening, after supper, she checked the stitching herself. He sat in the chair and she knelt beside it and cut the trousers back where they'd been cut before and looked at the wound in the firelight. The stitches had held through the morning's standing and the afternoon's ill-advised porch activity. The inflammation was worse than it had been yesterday, though better than it had been 3 weeks ago. The deep tissue was still doing its slow, patient work of knitting itself back together, which was a process that didn't care about timelines or plans or the wishes of the person it was happening inside. "It's not worse," she said. "It's not significantly better either. I know. You stood without the stick for too long this morning." I'm aware. If you do it again, Maren, she looked up. I know, he said. I was there. I made a choice about the stick, and I can account for it. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. Neither of them said anything about why he'd made that particular choice, why he'd left the stick inside and come to the doorway and stood there watching without his full capacity for movement. She thought she understood it. She thought it was the same reason she'd kept her voice level and her hands steady during everything that happened on the porch, not because she wasn't afraid, but because some moments required you to show up as a version of yourself that hadn't been diminished by circumstance, and the stick would have been a kind of diminishment in that particular moment. She understood it. She didn't say she understood it. She just put the dressing back in place and stood up and went to wash her hands. I'll get the stick if you do, he said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were thinking it loudly. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and went back to what she'd been doing. The days that followed the morning with Harlan had a different quality than the days before it. Not easier, necessarily. The work was the same work. The mountain didn't modify its demands based on what had or hadn't happened in the lives of the people on it. But something in the atmosphere of the cabin had shifted in a way she couldn't precisely describe. Something that had been held in tension, a thread pulled taut, had been cut, and the tension was gone, and she was still adjusting to what that felt like. She slept differently. That was the most concrete change. She had been a light, watchful sleeper her whole life. The kind of sleep that was always monitoring something, always maintaining a thread of awareness toward the door and the sounds outside it. Now she slept through things she would previously have woken to: the wind in the eaves, the fire settling, the horse moving in the barn. Still woke early, habit being what it was, but the waking was cleaner. Not the snap-awake readiness of someone who had never fully committed to sleep. Just ordinary morning consciousness arriving in its ordinary way. She noticed the change, and she thought about what it meant, and what it meant was that somewhere in the space between Harlan, riding away down the trail and the following morning, some background process she hadn't known had finished running. Something her body had been maintaining the constant low-level vigilance of a person who had never in their adult life been fully safe had decided to stand down. Not permanently. She wasn't naive about that. The world was what it was, and she knew what it was. But for now, with a specific arrangement of walls and fire and work, and one other person who had consistently proven himself trustworthy, not through declarations but through action, for now the vigil could rest. It was Silas who brought up the question about a week after the morning on the porch. He did it the way he did most things, directly, without preamble, in the middle of something entirely ordinary. They were at the table, eating supper. She'd made a stew that was better than the first 15 stews she'd made on this mountain, which was to say it was actually good rather than merely edible, and she was aware of the improvement without making a point of it. He was eating it with the straightforward appreciation of a man who valued food primarily for what it did rather than what it was, which meant he ate it consistently and finished it without commentary, which she had come to understand was his version of a compliment. He set down his spoon and said, "Spring's coming." She looked at him. "I know, passes will open in 6 weeks. Maybe 7 if the weather holds cold." "I know," she said again. She'd been tracking the season the way she tracked everything on this mountain, now systematically, with attention, building the pattern from the daily evidence. The light was different. The quality of the cold had changed. The marten on the north trap line had shifted its runs, which she'd noticed and adjusted for. "You'll have options," Silas said. He was looking at his bowl rather than at her, which she recognized as his way of giving her room to respond without the pressure of being watched while she did it. "There's enough gold from this season's trapping to set you up somewhere. Not richly, but enough to start something." He paused. "West Territory's opening up. Oregon settlements are taking people who can work. There's a woman I've traded with in the Larimer County settlements who runs a small operation. I could write to her if you wanted an introduction. She's honest." He stopped. He'd said what he had to say and he wasn't going to add to it. She looked at her stew for a while. When did you start thinking about this? She said. November, he said. When you came up the mountain. I've been thinking about it since November. You've been thinking for 4 months about how to make sure I had somewhere to go. Yes, she sat with that. Most people wouldn't have done that. Most people didn't spend 4 months watching you become someone who should have options, he said. It would have been wrong not to think about it. She looked at him across the table. He was still looking at his bowl, giving her the room, and she thought about the night in the saloon and the 3 seconds and the calculation she'd made. And she thought about how the calculation had been right for reasons she hadn't fully understood at the time. She'd calculated that he was better than Briggs. She hadn't calculated that he was the kind of man who spent 4 months quietly ensuring she had choices. That had been, she could admit it, beyond what she'd been capable of calculating then. Her expectations of what people did had been calibrated by Harlan, and Harlan's range was narrow and consistently directed toward his own interests. Tell me about the woman in Larimer County, Maren said. He told her. The woman's name was Ruth Calloway, and she'd been widowed twice and had built a small but functioning homestead in the foothills that produced enough to sell surplus in the nearest settlement. She needed capable hands. She was not, Silas said carefully, the kind of woman who made people feel small. Maren listened to all of it. She asked 2 questions, practical questions about the terrain and the distance from the nearest settlement with a doctor, and he answered them in the same practical register, and they finished supper, and she cleared the bowls and did the washing. Up and he stoked the fire, and neither of them said anything about the larger question that the conversation had opened. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about Ruth Calloway in the Larimer County foothills. She thought about the West Territory and the Oregon settlements, and the woman he knew who was honest and who didn't make people feel small. She thought about riding down the mountain in the spring with enough gold for a start and a letter of introduction, and the accumulated competence of a winter spent learning to take care of herself on terrain that didn't tolerate incompetence. She thought about Black Hollow and what it would mean to go somewhere. Nobody knew the name Vetch, and nobody knew the saloon story, and nobody had any particular expectations of her at all. She could be entirely what she'd become rather than what she'd been. That was its own kind of freedom. She thought about all of it with the focused and systematic attention she'd learned on this mountain to bring to important problems. She built the calculation from the actual evidence rather than from what she wished were true. On the 3rd day, Silas came in from the trapline in the late afternoon, his movement on the leg nearly normal now. Not quite what it had been before the injury, but close enough that she'd stopped watching it with professional concern, and she was sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee already poured. He looked at the cups. He took his coat off and hung it and sat down. I've been thinking about the spring, she said. I know you have. I've been thinking about Larimer County. He picked up his coffee. He waited. I've also been thinking about what you said. About options. She looked at her cup. You said I'd have options. You didn't say what you thought I should do with them. Not my place, he said. You have an opinion, though. He was quiet for a moment. Then I have something that's not quite an opinion. More like a wish that doesn't get to vote. He turned the cup in his hands. You should go wherever you're going to be most fully yourself. That's the only thing I'd say if someone asked me. And if I said this was that place, the fire made its sounds. The wind outside was still the winter wind, but with something underneath it that might eventually become something else. Then I'd say you should be sure, Silas said. Not sure because it's comfortable. Sure because it's what you actually want, which is different. I know it's different, she said. I've spent my whole life doing what was survivable instead of what I wanted. I know what that difference feels like, and... She looked at him across the table. He met her eyes the way he always did, directly, without performance, without the layer of social management that most people put between themselves and whatever they were actually looking at. And I want to stay, she said, not because I have nowhere to go. I have somewhere to go. You've made sure of that. I want to stay. because this is the place where I learned what I'm capable of. And because she stopped, found the words, because you are the first person I have ever been around who treated the things I could do as more important than the things you could do to me. And that is not a small thing, and I don't want to walk away from it just because I can. Silas set his cup down. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than his usual moments, which were already not short. Staying and leaving are both brave things, he said. I want to make sure you know that. I know that, she said. I'm not staying because I'm afraid to go. I'm staying because I want to be here. She paused. There's also the Martin on the north trap line. I've been adjusting for his new runs for 2 weeks and I want to see if my adjustment works. Something happened in Silas's face. The thing that was not quite a smile, but was in its neighborhood. She'd been cataloging its appearances since November and had gotten fairly good at identifying it. That's a legitimate reason, he said. I have several legitimate reasons, she said. That's one of them. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. The fire did its steady work. Outside, the mountain was beginning its long, slow shift from one season toward another, and neither of them said anything more about Larimer County or Ruth Calloway or Oregon, because the question had been asked and answered, and they were people who didn't revisit settled things without cause. What followed was not an ending. That was the thing she would understand better, as the seasons turned, that the moment she'd expected to feel like an ending was actually just another beginning, which was how things worked when you were still alive and still moving and hadn't yet run out of things to learn. Spring came slowly. It came the way things came on this mountain, without ceremony, without drama, in the accumulation of small evidence that something was changing. The snow settled and softened and pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. The light stayed longer. The quality of the cold in the mornings shifted from the settled, established cold of deep winter into something with more motion in it, more argument, cold and warmth trading territory back and forth across the same day. Silas's leg healed. Not perfectly. She didn't think it would ever be precisely what it had been before, and she thought he knew that too, though he didn't say so. And she didn't bring it up, because some things were better understood between people than stated between them. It healed well enough that he moved through the mountain again with confidence, that he ran the trapline at his old pace on good days, that he only accommodated the leg consciously when the cold was deep enough to make the old wound remember itself. She watched the progress with the clinical attention she'd developed over the weeks of his recovery, and she was satisfied with it. She had done good work on that wound. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them made more of it than it was. She was on the trapline alone one morning. In early April, the day was clear and sharp, and the snow on the north slopes still heavy, honeycombed with melt. The kind of snow that was beautiful to look at and treacherous to walk on when she found evidence of a third Martin run she hadn't known about. The prints in the snow were fresh, the trail cutting at an angle she hadn't seen before, up toward the high ledge that Silas had told her in November was not worth trapping because the approach was too difficult to make checking viable. She stood looking at the prints and thought about that assessment, and thought about the approach, and thought about whether anything she knew now changed the calculation. She climbed to the high ledge. It took longer than the direct route would have, because she knew now from weeks of observation that the mountain rewarded patience and punished impatience, and the snow on the most direct approach was the honeycombed kind that hid what was underneath. She stood on the ledge and looked out and stopped thinking about Martins entirely. The view from the high ledge was not something she'd seen before. She'd been to the North Trapline dozens of times, but always at the lower level, and the ledge had not been on any route she'd taken. From here, the valley below was visible in its full extent, a long fall of mountain and pine, and the distant glint of what must have been a frozen waterway, and beyond that, the suggestion of the lower territory, the settlements, the world that existed below and outside this particular arrangement of cabin and trapline and 2 people and 1 hard winter. She stood there for a while, just stood. The cold was in her face, and the view was enormous, and she was a very small person on a large ledge on an indifferent mountain, and none of those things were problems. She thought about the girl in the saloon staring at the brass rail. She thought about the 3 seconds. She thought about the Winchester's recoil in her shoulder and the first stitch she'd made in Silas's leg and the way her voice had sounded when she'd said, "I heard you to a man she'd been in a of for 23 years. She tried to find the thread that connected that girl to this woman, and she found it, and it was continuous, and the continuity mattered. She hadn't become someone else. She'd become more of herself. The parts that had been compressed and hidden and performed away had been given room to expand into their actual size, and their actual size was larger than she'd known. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. Not that she would discover she was capable, she'd suspected that, in the careful private inventory she'd maintained of her own abilities through years of pretending not to have them. What she hadn't anticipated was the size of what capability felt like when it wasn't being hidden. It felt large. It felt on a ledge above the winter valley with the cold in her face and no one watching, like more than enough. She came back down from the ledge and reset the north traps and came back to the cabin in the early afternoon and found Silas splitting wood on the far side of the porch. He was doing it well, full strokes, good power, the leg managing. She watched him for a moment from the tree line without his knowing she was there, which was something she would never have been capable of 4 months ago, and which now came as naturally as breathing. Then she stepped out of the trees. "There's a third marten run," she said. "Up at the high ledge. I went up and checked." He paused mid-swing and looked at her. "The high ledge approach is—" I went around the south side. Took longer, but the snow was solid. She paused. "The view from up there is something." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression. "I know," he said. "I haven't been up there in 2 years." He stopped. "Last time I went up was just before winter, year before last." "We should go when the snow consolidates," she said. "Both of us." He looked at her for a moment that held more than one thing. "Yes," he said. "All right." She went inside. She started the stove. She listened to the sound of wood splitting outside and thought that this was what regular life felt like, not the dramatic thing, not the before and after of a story, but the continuous ordinary of a life being lived in its specifics. Coffee and trap lines and wood splitting and the particular angle of afternoon light through the west window and someone outside making a necessary sound. She hadn't had a regular life before. She hadn't known what it felt like. She was learning it now, one ordinary day at a time, and she was finding that ordinary was not lesser than exceptional. It was the ground everything else grew in. There was a morning in May, full spring now. The snow gone from all but the highest north faces. The slower slopes green in the tentative way of mountain growth, cautious and real when a rider came up the trail. Not Harlan, not Briggs. A woman middle-aged, on a solid brown horse, with the upright posture of someone who'd spent a lot of time in the saddle and the directness of someone who hadn't come this far to be indirect. Maren was on the porch when the rider came through the tree line, and she stood and watched and kept her hands loose, which was a habit now, not the defensive habit it had started, as but the practical habit of someone who was comfortable and didn't need to demonstrate it through posture. The woman pulled up at the edge of the clearing. "I'm looking for Silas Rourke," she said. Her voice was direct. "No preamble. He's at the trap line," Maren said. "Should be back within the hour. You're welcome to wait." The woman looked at her, not assessing in the threatening way, just clearly looking, the look of someone who was accustomed to making quick evaluations. "You, Maren?" Maren paused. "Yes, Ruth Calloway," the woman said, and swung down from the horse with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "Silas wrote me in February, said if I was ever in the North Territory I should stop in." Ruth Calloway, the woman in Larimer County, the woman Silas had described as honest and who didn't make people feel small. She was here because Silas had written to her 4 months ago, before the morning on the porch with Harlan, before the conversation about spring and options. And Maren wasn't sure if she was supposed to know that timeline or if Silas had mentioned it and she'd lost the detail. She took Ruth's horse to the barn and got it water and came back to find Ruth, standing on the porch looking out at the view with the expression of someone taking a genuine inventory of a place. It's good country, Ruth said. Yes, Maren said. Hard. Very. Ruth looked at her. You've been here since November. Yes, Silas said you were. He described you a particular way. She paused. He said you were one of the most capable people he'd met on this mountain, and he'd been meeting people on this mountain for 15 years. She said it flatly, the way Silas said things. Not to flatter, not to manage, just to convey accurate information. Maren looked at the view. She didn't say anything for a moment. He said that, she said. Word for word, Ruth said. I don't usually travel this far out of my territory. But a letter from Silas Rourke saying something like that, I wanted to see what he was talking about. Silas came back from the trapline 40 minutes later and found them drinking coffee on the porch in what was, for two women who'd met less than an hour ago, a remarkably comfortable silence. He looked at Ruth and then at Maren and then back at Ruth with the expression of a man who is rapidly accounting for a development he may not have fully anticipated. Ruth, he said. Silas, she said. Nice country. Long ride. I wrote that you were welcome if you were in the North Territory. I wasn't in the North Territory, she said. I came specifically. I wanted to see the person you described. She glanced at Maren. I've seen her. She's what you said. Silas looked briefly as close to off balance as Maren had ever seen him. Found this privately satisfying. I'll get you coffee, he said, and went inside. Ruth watched him go. He doesn't write letters often, she said. No, Maren said. He's written me 3 and 4 years. First one was about a trade. Second was about a mutual acquaintance who'd gotten himself into a bad situation in the lower territory. Third was about you. Ruth looked at her steadily. I want you to understand what that means, coming from him. Maren understood what it meant. She sat with it and felt it settle in alongside everything else she'd been accumulating about what this place and this arrangement and this specific person actually were. Ruth stayed 2 nights. She and Silas talked about the territory and the season's prospects and mutual acquaintances in the lower settlements. She and Maren talked about Ruth's homestead and about the practical realities of mountain living and about the way settlers in the high country understood things differently than settlers in the valley. And the conversation was the conversation of 2 people who were interested in the same kinds of things for reasons that made sense to both of them. On Ruth's last morning, she and Maren walked out to the north trapline together. Maren showed her the Martin runs and explained the adjustments she'd made, and Ruth listened with the attention of someone who actually wanted to understand rather than someone waiting for their turn to speak. You could do this anywhere, Ruth said, at the second trap. Yes, Maren said. My offer is open, Ruth said. It's been open since February. Silas's letter was it was persuasive, and now that I've met you, I mean it more. I know, Maren said. Thank you. Ruth looked at her. But you're staying. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Maren said. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then good reason to stay. Maren thought about how to answer that honestly. She thought about the ledge above the valley and the view from it and the ordinary sound of wood splitting and coffee in the morning, and the particular weight of what it meant to be known by someone actually known, the real thing, not performed and managed and kept carefully in the dark. Several, she said. Ruth nodded once, the nod of a woman who understood several. They walked back to the cabin in the spring morning, and Ruth left after lunch, and the mountain settled back into its own sounds. That evening, Silas put a leather pouch and a folded document on the table in front of Maren without announcement. She looked at them. Open it, he said. She opened the pouch. Gold coin, a significant amount, more than she'd expected. She looked at the document, a letter in Silas's careful handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, stating the particulars of a horse that was being given as a gift, with the relevant description and the signature of Silas Rourke at the bottom, which constituted ownership transfer in the territories. She looked at him. Your debt is settled, he said. More than settled. That's your share of this season's trapping, a full share, same as mine for the work you put in. The horse is the gray. She knows you now. She looked at the gold and the document. I wasn't keeping a debt, she said. I didn't think of it that way. I know you didn't, he said, but I did, and it's settled. You should know it's settled. You should know that everything here, he gestured at the cabin, the mountain, the general everything of their situation, is yours on equal terms. Not because I'm being generous, because you've earned it equally, and I don't want there to be any confusion about that. She sat with the pouch and the document in front of her. What if I put the gold on the mantel and left the document on the table, she said. What would you do with that? He looked at her for a moment. Leave them where you put them, and if I went to the mantel right now and left the gold there. Then I'd know you understood what I was saying, he said. And we'd have coffee. She got up. She walked to the mantel. She set the gold pouch on the stone shelf above the fire. And she stood there for a moment, with her hand on the rough surface of the mantel, and felt the warmth of the fire below it, and thought about the brass rail in the rusty nail saloon that she'd stared at while her father offered her to a room full of strangers, and she thought about how different the things a person could rest their hand on were, and how much the difference mattered. She turned around. Coffee, she said. Silas made the coffee. She came back to the table, and they sat with their cups in the evening light, and she thought about what the word home meant and where you found it, and whether it was a place or a condition or a person or some combination of the three that was different for everyone who tried to locate it. She thought it might be the answer to a question you didn't know you were asking until you found yourself inside it. The question she'd been asking without words her whole life, whether there was somewhere she could exist at full size, without the compression, without the performance, without the constant calculation of how much of herself to make visible and how much to hide. That question had found its answer here, on a mountain that didn't care about her, tended by a man who did, in the space she'd filled by becoming the person the winter had revealed. It wasn't a perfect place. It was cold and hard, and the work was unending, and there were mornings when the isolation pressed in with its full weight, and she felt the edges of the world she wasn't part of, and had to make peace with that all over again. Silas was not an easy person to live alongside. He was private in ways she was still mapping, with silences that occasionally went too long, and a stubbornness about his own limitations that she was certain would be a recurring argument for as long as they knew each other. She was not easy either. She had years of survival habits she was still unlearning, reflexes that fired when they didn't need to, a distrust that was sometimes useful and sometimes just old pain wearing the clothes of caution. They were both imperfect, and they both knew it, and they'd both made peace with the imperfection of the other, because the things that were true about each of them were more important than the things that were difficult. That was, she thought, probably the best you could hope for from another person. Not perfection, not the absence of difficulty, just the honest accounting of a person who saw you fully and considered the full picture worth something. The seasons turned. Summer came to the high country in its brief, concentrated way intensely green, loud with the water from snowmelt, the mountain alive with things that had been waiting all winter for their chance. She learned the summer trapline, which was different from the winter one. She learned the summer version of the mountain, which was different again. The paths that were hidden by winter snow were revealed by summer melt, and she mapped them the way she'd mapped everything else. With the patient, systematic attention she'd brought to everything since November. She and Silas went to the high ledge on a June morning when the snow was fully consolidated and the approach was easy and the day was clear. They stood on the ledge together and looked out at the valley below, and neither of them said much about it. There wasn't much to say. It was the view. They were in it. That was enough. She began that summer to be known in the scattered settlements of the high country. Not widely, the distances were large and the population was sparse, and she wasn't seeking reputation. But the people who came to trade with Silas, who passed through on the northern routes, who had dealings with anyone in the high country, they began to know that there were two people at the Rourke cabin on the north face. And what they knew about the woman there was not what Harlan Vetch had told them, or what a saloon in Black Hollow had decided about her. What they knew was that she could track, trap, shoot, and heal, and that if you came to her with a wound or a problem, she would look at it clearly and tell you what it actually was. That was a reputation worth having. She'd built it out of the actual material of herself, not out of performance or strategy or any of the long-practiced arts of self-concealment. She'd built it by being what she was, fully, without apology. Harlan never came back. She hadn't expected him to. She heard, through the distant grapevine of mountain territory news, that he'd moved on from Black Hollow, gone south. Someone said, looking for easier ground. She didn't know if it was true, and she didn't pursue the question because the answer didn't change anything about her day. Briggs Coil she heard nothing about. She didn't pursue that question either. Black Hollow itself she heard about occasionally, a settlement that was contracting rather than growing, losing its more mobile residents to better prospects, the kind of place that would eventually become nothing more than a story someone told about somewhere they'd passed through once. She felt no particular weight at the news. She had left Black Hollow the night of the storm. She had not been back. She would not go back. Not because of the memory of the saloon or her father or Briggs Coil or any of it fit, but simply because the place had nothing she needed, and she had learned not to spend time on things that had nothing she needed. On a September evening, when the first edge of the next winter was beginning to make itself felt in the evening air, she sat on the porch steps with Silas and listened to the mountain settling into itself for the season. She had been on this mountain exactly 1 year. She thought about the girl who had ridden up the trail a year ago, behind a man she didn't know in a storm she couldn't see through, calculating odds and watching for exits and prepared to run the moment running made more sense than staying. She thought about what that girl had known and what she hadn't known, and what she'd learned and what she was still learning. Next year, she said. Silas beside her looked at her. I want to try the high trap line in January, she said. The one above the ledge. You've never worked it. Too high, he said. Weather's unpredictable above the ledge in January. The approach, I want to think about the approach, she said. I've been thinking about it since June. I think there's a route. He looked at her. He considered. Show me what you're thinking, he said. She told him. She'd been working it out since the June visit to the ledge, building the route in her mind from everything she knew about the mountain's terrain and weather patterns. And as she talked, she could see him listening with the full attention he gave to things that deserved full attention. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which were good questions that she had answers to. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. It might work, he said. We'd need to go up before January to establish the path before the deep snow. October, she said. Give it 2 trips in October. All right, he said. October. She looked at the valley below them, already filling with evening. The light that was left had the quality of late-season light, golden and slanted and a little sad, though she didn't find sadness in it tonight. She found it accurate, the light of a day finishing. The right light for the time. She had entered this mountain believing silence was the only weapon she possessed. She had been wrong about that. Though the wrongness hadn't been her fault, she'd made the best possible use of the information she had, and the information she had at 9 years old had been both accurate and incomplete. She had not known then that silence was a tactic, not a truth. She had not known that the voice she'd pressed down wasn't gone. She had not known that there was a version of herself that could exist at full volume, full capacity, full presence, without the constant reduction of someone else's fear requiring her to be smaller. She knew now. The knowing had cost something 14 years. A winter of work, a night of fear in a saloon, weeks of building a self from raw material, in temperatures that didn't care whether she managed it or not. It had cost the kind of cost that couldn't be refunded. But you didn't get the knowing without the cost, and she'd stopped wishing the cost away. The cost was part of the knowing. The difficulty of it was what made the result real. She heard herself humming the song her mother had known, the one she'd told Silas about that night, early in the winter, the first private thing she'd shared with him. She was humming it without having decided to, The way she'd started to hum things on this mountain, in the easy, unself-conscious way of someone who had stopped monitoring whether they were allowed to take up space. Silas heard it. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside her on the step and let the song be exactly what it was, a small sound made by a person who felt safe enough to make it, and let the evening be what it was. And let the mountain be what it was, and let the year be what it had been. She was home, not because it was the only place available, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she had looked at everything available to her Ruth Calloway in Larimer County, the Oregon settlements, the whole open West territory, and she had found that this particular place, with this particular history and this particular person beside her in the September dark, was what she actually wanted. Choice was freedom. That was the thing she'd learned this year above everything else. Not the having of things, or the safety of things, or the completion of things choice. The ability to say yes to something because you meant yes, not because yes was the only option the world had left you. She had said yes to this mountain and this life and this arrangement with her eyes open and her information complete and her capacity for doing otherwise fully intact. That was the yes worth having. The first star appeared in the east. Then another. The valley below went dark, and the sky above went immense and cold, and they sat in it together. Two people who had learned that silence could be chosen rather than imposed, and who had both, in their different ways, and from their different starting places, found their way to the same quiet place, not the silence of hiding, not the silence of fear, but the silence of two people who had nothing left to prove to each other, and were content for this moment to simply be. The mountain held them both. It did not care about their stories, their scars, their 14 years of pretending, or their one winter of becoming. It was simply the mountain, but they were on it together, and the stars were coming out, and there was work tomorrow and every day after that for as long as the mountain kept them. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.